Yo, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and greetings to everyone who is listening. Today, we have with us Pastor. How you doing, Pastor?
I'm doing really good.
It's been a long time, huh?
It's been too long, actually.
Yeah. So we have with us Pastor Wood today, our honored special guest. And today, we're going to touch upon, I think, a very important topic that affects all people, regardless of faith, culture, or background. And, we have this drug epidemic that's happening. We have this, and it's affecting all people. And, of course, faith plays a huge role in how to assess or recover from drug. And also, people have different approaches of prohibition, what is allowed, what is not allowed. And then you have also the law. But before we start, just tell us a little about yourself and how we met. And
Sure. At first, thank you for having me. And it's an honor just to be here and a privilege that you would even trust me enough to come and speak to your people, and especially since you know me.
yeah.
But I have been in ministry, for 14 years, where I work specifically around addiction, mental health issues, brokenness. And most of that comes from the fact that I personally have been sober for 14 years. So I have my own story of brokenness and addiction that I went through for, 20 some years of my own life, and tried to turn that around and try to use that to help other people. But about 2 years ago now, you and I met as part of the faith leaders, group that was coming together, trying to bring awareness to the opiate crisis in the Tampa Bay area. And you and I just really hit it off and got to be friends. And you've taken me out to dinner, and you got me here today. So
Yeah, I remember it was April 2018. And I was told it was an interfaith dialogue. And usually when you go to an interfaith talk, you're expecting people talk about the different faith for 10 minutes. And then I went there and they're talking about opiates. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't know what that was. I know it's okay, this drug, and then you learn about it. And there were Dr. Bond or Joe Bond, who started the initiative from USF. They were talking about the 4E. So we came in there, and from that moment on, we were able to click and, do one of the events at your location where you guys were at the University Mall. And we did another opioid crisis event at that same center in near Hillsborough. And we realized how big of this is affecting us in Tampa, and how widely spread it is and the use of it. And some people say, well, they're more concerned with opiates because it affects white people, probably. Drug epidemic has been happening for a very, very long time, and whether it's heroin and other things, and not much has been done. The fact of the matter is, we're working towards that. And then the other issue that came from that, as you mentioned, the mental health issues that spur from this, and these are a lot of these things we would say are some causes, right, or symptoms, but the cause it can be anxiety and depression. So what would you say would cause people to get into addiction? What would probably want them to do drugs to begin with? Especially, let's say their conditions are not as bad. Their parents have money. They have the things that people need in life. What do you think causes that?
So I consider myself a student of addiction, because constantly studying, constantly learning, because there's so much information out there about the topic. And even since I've met you over the last couple of years, my knowledge has actually shifted and changed, because you just start to learn new things. And I see more and more that addiction is actually it's a way out of pain. And so a person is in pain, whether they subconsciously or consciously realize that, but some type of a psychological pain, and addiction becomes a way to get temporary relief from that. One of the things that most people miss, because I believe that it's easier to just think that addiction is a person's bad choices, because if we just simply say that a person could choose not to use drugs or alcohol or sex or whatever, so it's really on them. But addiction, first and foremost, is not a choice. no one would choose to be a drug addict. No one would choose to be, a sex addict. So it's not a choice. It's ultimately a reflection of the person, the individual's life, their life experiences, and trauma that they've been through. There's a simple thing that I've learned, and that is that all people that suffer childhood trauma don't necessarily become addicts, but every addict has went through childhood trauma. And that's pretty universal. Now, what a person's trauma might look like may be different. So what I may think is trauma to me may not be trauma to you, or vice versa. And it may not be the outright, major trauma that everybody looks at and feels aghast, but it's a trauma nonetheless. And so a big part of how we as a society move forward in recovery from addiction and recovery from mental health, issues is going to be by learning and educating ourselves on the very things that cause a person later on in life to become addicts.
Yeah, I mean, you bring that up. So when you mentioned the word trauma, so trauma can differ, you're saying, from person to person.
Yeah.
So, for example, it doesn't necessarily mean their parents were abusive,
right?
All right, or something happened. It can be simply someone who lives in a nice house and drives a nice car, but they go through a certain trauma. Now, what do you say about those who do drugs? They say they're doing it for fun.
That is a really good question, because that is something that even the people in the medical professional world of studying addiction can't necessarily agree upon. What I've come to know is I'm 51 years old and constantly studying addiction, looking back at my own story, and I still struggle with addiction. And I'm learning new things about myself almost daily about why I was an addict. So I do not think that a person who maybe they believe they're doing something because it's fun even recognizes the fact that they're doing it because of childhood trauma. I do believe that most people in the middle of using don't even realize why they're doing it. I know I didn't. I know I never did during my use. It wasn't until later.
And so here, when you say, at the beginning you said that they may go through some pain, and I think understanding that pain, a lot of people fail to realize that there's some pain. How about loneliness and depression? Is that included in the trauma when you mentioned trauma?
Well, I don't think there's very much. Why do I don't know if you realize this, but they say that one of the worst things that you can do to prisoners is put them in isolation.
Correct.
Loneliness. The most painful thing a person would almost rather be, tortured to some degree than left alone in permanent isolation. Because at least if I'm being tortured or abused, I have my torturer with me. I'm not alone. But as human nature is, that we are not created to be alone, no matter what faith you believe in. We're not created to be alone. We're created to be in relationship with one another. And loneliness, most definitely, is one of the most painful things that we go through.
Yeah, and technology can only fill it temporarily for so much, for so long. But reality of the matter is, I agree 100%. Where God has created us in a way where we need to interact. We're social beings. Now, do you mind sharing that story? It sounds very intriguing, like that story, like what actually happened.
Which story?
The addiction story, and how you came to and stop and so forth.
Well, I think for me, what I went through was, for me personally, was very painful and very, I knew in the middle of it, it was like, my own form of trauma. Maybe it wasn't as bad as some, but, it was bad for me. My home life came from, a broken home where my mother and father split up when I was in first grade, but my father left my mother for a younger woman. And when he did, my oldest brother went with him. And a year later, my oldest brother was working with my dad on one of his construction sites and fell and died. So if you understand the dynamic, my father left my mother for a younger woman. That's pain. Took my oldest brother with him. Then my brother dies. Therefore, it's my father's fault. So that's pain. And I was the youngest of 5, and I was the youngest by quite a few years, 6, 7 years. And so my mother, looking at me, seeing, the reason my father left her. He had raised the 4 other kids, but he looked at me and said, I'm done. I didn't ask for another child. I've done my parenting. I'm moving on. And the reason that's so critical to the story is because I was then raised by my mother who, I know she did the best she can. And I now know she was suffering from her own mental, depression and bipolar. But at the time, all I felt like was a kid who wasn't wanted, was hated by his mother, was hated by, his father, because somehow I became the reason my brother was dead, the reason my father had left my mother. And so growing up, we can sense that. We can sense when we're not loved. We can sense when there isn't that type of nurturing that, quite frankly, God created us to experience it to some degree. And because of that, that led me to, live a life of constantly trying to somehow attain a feeling of being accepted, being loved, cared about. And I found that through sex. I found that through drinking. I later found that through hard drugs. And it caused me to, go through sleeping with more women than I care to announce publicly, with doing more drugs than I can't even believe I'm still alive. And, from basically my early 20s to early 30s, I attempted suicide 6 times. I attempted suicide 7 times overall in my life, but one of them was before my 20s. I, don't remember any of it because I was in a drunken, drugged out phase where I really don't recollect much of what happened. And what's unfortunate is I was married and had a son, and I, wasn't mentally present for any of that. And then, eventually when my son was 1 year old, I had a nervous breakdown, and my wife at the time she looked at me, and I didn't sign up for this, and left me. At that point, I went into complete, mental shutdown, and basically everybody in my life at that time just said, you're too out there for us. And honestly, I was. And so I became, homeless, in and out of psychiatric wards, in and out of detox units. Like I said, multiple suicide attempts, and, just wanted out of this life. I wanted somehow for this pain to end. Eventually I was in a detox after, or actually a psychiatric ward after one final attempt at trying to take my life, and left there, and I had nowhere to go. My brother had told me, don't, trespass me. My father had said, I don't want to see you. And, I was just walking down a road and feeling like I honestly don't know where to go. I have nowhere to go. I can't believe I can't die because I keep trying. And I looked up at the sky and I said, God, if you're real in some way, either end this pain, let me die, or do something, because I hardly think that, you're doing this for your own humor. And right then my phone rang, and it was a guy that I'd met in a detox a year before. And he said, hey man, you okay? And I said, no, I'm not. And he said, well, I just had the strangest feeling from the Lord that you're in trouble and I should reach out. And I said, yeah. And he came and picked me up and took me to this old man that was a believer in Jesus. And that old man showed me the love and acceptance that I'd always sought for. And obviously, my own faith journey, I came to Jesus at that point and found a different reason to live. which was to help people understand addiction more, understand brokenness more, and to make recovery as a whole possible, easy, more accessible for those that were trying to recover. And, you know, it was at that point that I was able to find sobriety and a new path in life, which I would love to be able to sit here today and say that, you know, it was like this picture perfect story at that point and everything was great, but it wasn't. You know, I relapsed multiple times. I struggled. And even after finally getting sober for the last time, you know, 2 or 3 years after being sober, my sister died from a drug overdose. And I'd been trying to help her. And so at this point, I'm a counselor, I'm a pastor, I'm sober, I'm helping other people, and then I can't even help my own sister. And, you know, I'd really felt like I failed at that point and needed to do more and reach more people somehow. And lo and behold, 7 months after my sister died from a drug overdose, my brother died from a drug overdose. And, you know, I think we all have a breaking point, and there's this point in our life when some break and some just say that's enough. And for me, I felt like breaking, and luckily I had people in my life that were like, you can't, this isn't a reason to break. This is a reason to push forward. And I, you know, pushed forward. And that's when I started the Timothy Initiative, which is an organization that helps men with addiction, and was able to really see some real miracles happen by watching men find long-term recovery, and all of it through my own pain and my own story of addiction. I don't have to hide from that. That's actually the reason we find success.
Wow. That was a lot.
Yeah. Well, you should try living it.
You know, when doing these, like whether a lecture or a talk or even this podcast, it's like hearing this, it's like this, it really hits home. Like it really hits hard. And, you know, losing one loved one is tough. Mm-hmm. Right. But losing, you know, your brother and sister in the same year, it reminds me of, you know, when we talk about our Prophet Muhammad, you know, it was called the year of sorrow. Yep. When he lost his wife, his uncle, they were like his pillars and main supporters. And even though he was a prophet, it was called, like, and we say Arabi Am al-Huzn, the year of sorrow and sadness, and, you know, and God comforted him in a different way. And for you to experience that and to be that strong, you know, it's pretty amazing. And I commend you for that, and a lot of respect for that. And because the easy thing is to, or I'm not gonna say easy, but when you're heading a dead end, you know, you see probably no light at that tunnel, mm-hmm. or no light and sometimes in a world of darkness. And you know, losing your sister and your brother and your other brother earlier when you were mm-hmm. younger, you know, it's a very huge test. And what would you say, like at that point, how important was it to have people around you mm-hmm. who were supportive at those points? Yeah.
You know, I don't think I can even put a value high enough on it. I know that if I did not have a community of people around me that loved me and cared for me and supported me, I wouldn't have made it. I would not have made it through. I think part of people that have suffered through addiction and mental health issues is, I hate to say it, but there's always this small voice in the back of our head that says there's a reason to go back out. It's just there. And I see it as a counselor when I help other people, and something will happen in their life, and I'll be like, that's going to be the reason they go back out. That's mm-hmm. because it's just like we just need enough of a reason to give up. And so having people around me that knew enough about me, my past, and to know enough about what it takes to stay the course. You know, let's just say this. I believe the community of people around me was so important. And then I personally believe that, you know, God gave a few of those people the right words at the right moment, because there was some moments where I was like, it didn't matter who was around me, I was going to give up. For example, there was this one moment where I was done, and this guy that is a friend of mine came up to me and he said, this is a reason for, this, you may feel like all these failures is a reason for you to not be a leader, but I think actually it's going to be through this brokenness and weakness that you're going to be a better leader than you ever could have been. And he actually said, because quite frankly, before this, you were kind of prideful and you were kind of perfect. And so perfect, prideful leaders tend to make people feel like they can't relate. They may follow you and they may be like, wow, that person's got it together and I want that. But when it comes right down to it, they can't relate to you. And so I didn't even know that about myself, but him saying it in that moment, he was right. And, he's like, this will be the reason now people can relate with you because you're broken just like everybody else. And that's a reason to go forward. And it was in that moment that I was like, okay. And I just was able to push forward.
I mean, I think I agree with you. I mean, if you look at we believe the best of men to walk the earth were the prophets. Mm-hmm. And they had to deal with internal issues themselves. And, this life is a struggle and a test. Now, I want to ask you what you thought about this. Mm-hmm. When people now, when you go to any like mental health conference or workshop, and you have all those people who have tables, hey, call this number, call it. We don't have a lack of numbers to call, but most people probably will not like call those numbers or go to those centers, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have places of worship, the synagogue, the church, the masjid, or the mosque. And sometimes, people maybe have good intentions, but people don't feel safe going to those places, or people don't feel welcome going to this place. And part of the reason you mentioned is like, they don't feel the people up top are relating to their issue, mm-hmm. and there develops a certain type of stigma mm-hmm. from that. How would you say the church was, or are all churches welcoming? I mean, in our case, some mosques, or many are not, they're probably because, some of them from the older generation, a lot of them haven't experienced it, or haven't dealt with it, except probably, a lot of the African-American mosques, they have experience with this. They know, mm-hmm. how to deal with these situations to a certain extent, more than the immigrant community. But how would you say, what would you say about the church? Was there a stigma? If somebody came and you were known to be a drug addict, or would you go to the priest or the pastor and say, I have this problem? How would the reaction be? I
want to try to choose my words wisely because I love the church. I love all faith and leaders of faith. And I know we all mean the right things, but often it doesn't happen. And I obviously can't speak for the Muslim faith, but I do know that all faiths, the leaders do it because of a genuine love for other people. But I can just say in the Christian faith, it has not been good. My experience, I mean, I've been part of Christian rehabs where they made the men sit in the back, not associate with anybody that was in the building. Feeling like, outcast. I've seen several bad, examples of what should be a place where a person feels welcome. So I don't think it's been handled entirely great, but I mean, I do believe that there's those that have done it well. I happen to be, when I got to Tampa, part of an organization, that did handle it right and did believe in acceptance and love and caring for one another and trying to be in each other's life no matter what was wrong. So there's those that do it well, but I think genuinely, as a whole, it hasn't been handled well. I do feel that we're going through a reformation right now of all things that are all faith because of the COVID and I think that people are reevaluating their priorities. People are reevaluating how they handle things like faith. So my hope is that through this whole entire, crisis, that it's kind of leveled the playing field where now people can see, It just takes a few bad things and we can all end up in each other's shoes.
Correct.
And I believe it's through that we can begin to say, maybe I shouldn't judge this person or stigmatize this person. Maybe I should learn about this person.
No more, definitely. I think the more we understand one another, and the more we realize how uncommon we are, and we have similar things that we go through as human beings. You mentioned going to the church and going through the rehab. How difficult is it to actually stop? Like say marijuana or LSD or heroin. Like how hard is it, and how much mental strength does it take to do so? Well,
on mental strength, you can't do it. So let's just say that right now. I believe mental strength, once you're in addiction, is out the door. So it's going to take something outside of yourself to help you. Now, lots of people turn to lots of different things, and that's okay. But it's going to take something more than mental strength. If once you've crossed that threshold of into addiction, and let's just say this: what is addiction? The typical definition of addiction is doing something repetitively, even though you know that doing so could cause you harm or death, you still won't stop.
Yeah. So I have a question about that.
Okie dokie.
I sit with a lot of young people. Even today, I sat with someone, and they'll say, I'm not addicted to marijuana. I do it every now and then. Or I'm not addicted to this. And then, but you see, as years progress, they're not only addicted to it, they're selling it, they're dealing it, but they're convinced they're not addicted. So so I know in the beginning you said subconsciously, we probably don't realize it. So what goes through their mind? How are they convinced that they're not addicted to it? Is it because they do it every now and then, and they know it harms them? And now we have the whole issue of it becoming legal, the marijuana. So what do you think goes through the people's minds? What do you think they think addiction is? Is that, oh, I do it every day, or they have a misinterpretation of addiction itself?
This is part of why I think addiction is so hard to understand from an outsider, from somebody who's in it. Doesn't matter. Why is it so hard to understand? It's because of values. You have a certain value system. I have a certain value system. Everybody watching right here has a certain value system. We mix up the fact that we're looking at someone and we're interpreting their actions through the lens or perception of our values, which then you're never going to understand addiction. You're saying this person won't stop even though, it's harming certain areas of their life. Well, you don't know what those areas of their life mean to them. That's where it gets complicated. It's, we all want to think that, shouldn't they care about, relationship with their parents or their brothers or their sisters or their family or the synagogue or the church? But what if they don't?
Yeah, a lot of times they don't, yeah.
What if their value system's just we're thinking the things that they get taken away from them matter as much to them as they would to us. And they don't often.
That makes me a very important question. So say, for example, to be 100% real, the main thing that matters to most in our value system is the faith and connection to God. And for some, that from what I'm understanding is that, they may be important to me, all right, that this is important, but for them, at this point, they don't mind losing that. Is that what I guess you're getting?
Yeah. Well, it's that, and it's anything. I mean, we look at repercussions for the things that we do to somebody who's using, let's say, a 16-year-old kid who gets caught smoking pot. So we take away his phone, we take away his laptop, we take away his car, but he keeps using, and we must be an addict. Well, we don't know that because we really don't know if he cares about those things. We think he does, but he might not. So I think there's that on the smaller scale. And then the whole faith part on the larger scale, that's typically even when we get into hardcore addiction, I don't know about with the Muslim faith, but I know that in the Christian faith, we often have this saying, I don't actually use it, but I've heard it used, where I don't even know if that person's actually saved. Where basically, the Christian faith, it's, you got to say you believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and you believe that, and you want to follow him and turn your life over to him. But those are just words. And so in the Christian faith, a lot of times you'll see somebody that can say those words, but then live totally apart from those words. And sometimes it's because they're an addict and they can't control themselves. But then there's the other side of that where they're actually not a Christian. They say they are because maybe they want people to believe they are. Honestly, I feel like we have a president right now who says he's a Christian and he's not. So
talking about Trump?
Yeah, that's what we won't go there. But personally, that's my belief. But so it's that easy when we look at faith, where I don't really know if a person's a Christian. I don't really know if a person's Muslim. All we know is their religious activities. They go to the things they're supposed to go to, and they say the things they're supposed to say.
Yeah, and actually, they say around 25% of people in this country don't even believe in God.
Right.
And I would say a lot of people, one of the premise that this country was established was upon rejection of the Catholic Church, because it was imposed upon. They came here and they made this country secular and the education secular. You're not even allowed to mention God in the anthem in school and textbooks. And that in itself has effects, because religion has been taken out of the lives of people and it's reduced to rituals and like more of like not reality. And also, what I see, or I guess what we see, is that a lot of people are leaving the faith altogether, all types of faith, right? They're like, I don't want to feel guilt. I don't want you to tell me about this religion is going to punish me for this. I want to be able to do whatever I want. YOLO, right? As they say, you only live once.
Yeah.
Right. So, and then you have the music culture that's added to that. I want to just ask a small tangent on the side. You know how you mentioned sex addict? Would you say sex today has been replaced by pornography? Like people like do more of that to replace and get addicted to that also, instead of the actual sex itself, because people are a lot more at home and they don't have, they don't probably go out as much. I think
pornography has had an incredibly devastating effect on intimacy in marriages. It's had an incredibly devastating effect on the youth that are coming up on understanding what true intimacy is. It's had a tremendously devastating effect on singles that can now feel some sort of relief through watching pornography rather than actually becoming intimate, whether sexually or just personally with other people. So I believe it's had, it's definitely impacted. We won't even see the true impact of pornography for generations, because it's fairly, the ease and accessibility of it all is 5-10 years old. So we really won't know for a while what the long-term effects of it are, but it's definitely had a major effect. I know in sex addiction meetings, more and more you see people that are in there because of pornography. But even the pornography, it's still because of something that's missing, a pain that's in a person's life. It's seldom, if ever, just because a person really likes it.
Yeah, and that's a whole different discussion of pornography. We can probably address that in a different podcast, because I think that's a taboo subject that's not talked about.
Yeah, it's a very deep topic, very deep.
Yeah,
and then I feel like the way out of it is going to be controversial.
Yeah. So well, I would love to probably talk about that one time, because that is something that, especially even after the pandemic, where it has been up high. In March, they said in the first week alone, it went up 13%, and it's increasing in our society and around the world, for that part. But going back to understanding, so let's, I guess, give a scenario. I come to you. I'm like, hey, how you doing, Pastor? My son, I just found him. He did marijuana, and I'm going crazy. And my parents overreacting. Especially the mothers. Dads are probably doing with him. I'm just kidding. So then he comes in there. She's panicking. It's like the day of judgment all over again. And she's like, "What do I do with my son? Like you said, I want to take his phone away. I'm gonna take his car away. I'm gonna do all those things. he has a 5.0, 6.0, 10.0 GPA. He's academically really well. And he says to me, I don't care if you take my phone away. I don't care. My friends love me for who I am. And in fact, I'll bring you some marijuana, if that's the case. And they say, well, God's going to get mad at you. They say, I don't care. All right. So what would you do first with the parent? And then how would you adjust the child or their kid?
Let me say this. I want, probably my least favorite thing to do is that scenario, because often it's often the parents. They play a role in this, and just like the husband who comes and says my wife has been drinking too much, or the wife who comes and says my husband is doing too many drugs. Often there's a correlation between the two. Mm-hmm. And most people want a person's addiction to be their issue. I just don't want you to have it, so fix it. And that's often not how it works. The answer to recovery and how recovery will end up becoming effective is when everyone embraces it. So in that scenario, which is a much deeper scenario than you even realize, because you mentioned, I know you just said that story off the cuff, but you said something very key. If this was an actual situation that would have stuck out to me, you said, the other kids accept me for who I am. They'll even bring me the weed. My question would go to, does he not feel accepted at home? Because ultimately, that's what that sounds like to me. How a person or a parent raises their child, that's totally on them. But if it may be leading them in today's society to these other things. Do I think a person, if that scenario came to me, do I think that person's an addict? No, I don't. I think he's dealing with some issues at home. I would probably recommend a good family therapist where they could talk through why the kid feels like he needs to go do these things. What does he feel like? Why does he feel like he only gets acceptance from other kids? Why does he feel like he needs that so bad?
So then so you would say first off, it's really diagnosing the issue.
Yep, absolutely.
Right? And kind of parents probably need counseling themselves at this point, because they need to take it easy. It's a problem. Mm-hmm. We're not saying it's not right, or we're not saying it's right. We know it's wrong, but this is only going to make it worse. Mm-hmm. And that window of opportunity of him listening may even be vanished quicker than you may think it is. Right now, now the thing is on the other end. Right, when if you were to sit with that person, and say this person, say it's my son. All right, we're friends.
Yeah,
and it's like, and that it can lead toward like a destructive path if not handled correctly. What conversation would you have with that person, with the loving and care and understand? What would you advise that person?
If I was sitting down with your son, for example, I would, I think education is always important, even though I think most kids sort of realize this. But it is important to know that often mistakes are made. I mean, parents want to jump right to they're going to become an addict and on the street shooting drugs. That's not where I would go with the scenario. I would probably go with, when you're high and you're with all your friends, you make judgments that you're now impaired in making. And one of those bad judgment calls may cost you the rest of your life. My own son did, in fact, get caught smoking weed in high school twice. And the talk I had with my own son was, life is like a table, and on that table are opportunities. And every bad move we make, some of those opportunities come off the table, never to return. You have to look at the things that you're doing and the actions that you're taking and recognize that some of them may accidentally cause you to remove things from this table filled with opportunity. And they almost did in his case, because he's a great football player. He had a football scholarship, and got caught with weed, and it almost cost him the scholarship. And so it was a real thing. But that same conversation is the conversation I would have with any teenager. You, in an impaired state, you may not set out to do cocaine, but you may be at a party, and after smoking some weed with your friends, and now there's a cute girl that's there, and you're flirting with her, and she's like, hey, I actually want to do some cocaine. Would you want to try some? There's a good chance you're probably going to try it. And there's a good chance that maybe you end up liking it. And then that leads to a whole nother level of things that you didn't think that you would go to. Once again, I'm not saying you're going to become a cocaine addict, but I can tell you this, doing cocaine is going to escalate how many bad decisions you're going to make quickly. So I think it's about trying to relate to the mistakes that parents often make are the jumping to the worst case scenario, which I believe most kids shut that off right away. You know, they don't hear you. Like, they already know you're going to say you're going to be an addict, homeless on the street, shooting drugs. And they already know that that's very far from where they are mentally. Let's look at it this way. Teenagers, what do they have the hardest time doing? And that's seeing a process through. So to them, I smoked some weed with some friends last night. You're telling me I'm going to end up homeless on the streets. There's way too many steps in between. I can't even relate to that. We as adults with a matured mind can be like, I can see all the different steps along the way. They can't. So look at the next step and try to impress that upon them.
That makes a lot of sense. So, and you probably deal with this a lot, right? I think you hear the Share Here Sober Truth project. Is that a new project you guys started?
So over the years, as you know, running the Timothy Initiative and seeing some really amazing things happen. For example, our organization sees, 90% of our men make it to 2 to 3 years sober. Just to give you an idea, the majority of people that try to enter, recovery, try to get sober, 2 out of every 10 make it a year. So 2 out of 10 make it a year. We have the flip side of that. Like basically 9 out of 10 make it 3 years with us. And so our statistics are like off the charts. In fact, USF just contacted me and they want to come in and like study what we do. They want to do an actual study of how we do what we do. And I realized, what we're doing needs to be shared with the world. And I'd had this in my mind for a couple of years that I really wanted to try to start something. And, like most of the things in my life, it's usually out of some form of travesty, something is birthed. And 2 years ago in December, I had one of my good friends committed suicide. And a week later, somebody who was like a son to me committed suicide.
Wow.
My best friend's son took his life. He jumped off the Skyway Bridge. And those 2 deaths, having to go to 2, memorials, the same week, having to sit with 2 families in the same week, and then reflecting on my own life and my own attempts at taking my life. And then, over the last 5 years, I've had 6 people close to me die from suicide. My own mental health issues, my own, watching people around me in ministry with mental health issues. And so I really felt like I needed to take what I had experienced and try to help people in the world. And Sober Truth Project was birthed. It's an attempt at showing the world a different way of looking at recovery. Because I think, when we look at mental health issues, suicidal issues, and of course addiction, I think one of the biggest things that perpetuates it is shame. That feeling of, needing to hide from the world. And that's also the thing that, keeps people stuck in cycles of not being able to get better. And so education around what recovery needs to look like, education around what causes addiction, what causes mental health and suicidal thoughts, and education around what actually works in those scenarios, I believe is critical. So Sober Truth Project is an attempt at really doing those things by, educating, empowering, informing, and also giving people a sense of hope by recognizing that recovery can be more accessible than you think it is.
Yeah, that's pretty good stuff. I mean, you have USF coming out to check it out. And I'm sorry to hear about all these, people you've lost. I do want to mention this. I didn't mention this earlier. There's a verse in the Quran that states, when Prophet Noah, who told his son, don't go on the mountain, come in the ark to be saved. And his son said, no, I'm going to go on top of the mountain. And he's a prophet himself, or has direct connection to God. And his son, dies and drowns. And God says, you don't guide whom you love, God guides whom you please. And you talked about your sister, and, and I'm sorry to hear about that. Like, as people, especially who are activists, who are promoting this, you're a pastor, an imam, and you're constantly dealt with these situations, then when it happens from within, it really hits you differently. People are like microscoping, oh, look at what you're doing, look at your kids, look at your son or daughter, look at your brother or sister. And people don't realize we're humans, and we make mistakes. We have ups and we have downs, and it's actually tougher a lot of times. Especially, when people say practice what you preach, and, this idea of hypocrisy that comes up, and you're always feeling, you have an idea that you're trying to avoid these things because you're saying something and people are listening to you. All eyes are on you. And then it hits you it hits you in a way where you never expect, because you can hear about it and from all outside of the families. When it happens to your own family, it's hard. But the one thing is that we're taught is that we can't blame ourselves for something what we can control is the effort, the care. The results are out of our control. And I'm sorry to hear that. I forgot to mention that earlier. I just want to, point that out as a tangent. But the other thing you mentioned here, I mean, we would love to learn more about the Sober Truth Project, because I know you had the TMC initiative, and really, what are the things that are working? Now, one thing I want to ask: if somebody comes and says, "I don't care how good you guys are, I don't want to be helped," at that point, is there really much you can do?
No.
Right. So there has to be an intent to want to be helped. Okay. And that's why I guess I was kind of asking in the beginning, same, like going back to my son, my son is that example. All right. Hopefully my son never does drugs. All right. But, and he says, and I guess the word, the addiction issue comes, he's like, they don't realize there is a problem. All right. And that's why they don't feel the need for help or even have a conversation. Like, look, man, I'm just doing this for fun, recreational. It makes life good. So at that point, I guess they're listening. Here's where you got to, I guess, would you direct them and saying, look, this is not going through, I guess, to the next step, not 10 steps ahead, I guess, as many parents would do. And for example, and I was telling you this yesterday, would you recommend, that, the kid does weed or twice or 3 times or for a couple months to just go put him in a rehab center? Is that a smart idea?
No, that's a really bad idea. We talked yesterday briefly and agreed to talk about this on air. The reason you don't want to put somebody in a rehab before it's time is because a lot of people that are going to be in that rehab belong there. And people that belong there probably have done harder things than weed and probably have done it way more regularly. And human nature is to go to the lowest common denominator for whatever reason. And so if you put people in a room together, they go to that lowest common denominator. And so on more than one occasion, I know a lot of adults that are currently in addiction that started out because they got caught smoking weed and their parents put them in a rehab, and they met somebody in there that smoked crack, and they left the rehab together and went with that person and smoked crack for the first time. I've heard that story so many times where if your kid or someone's kid is in the local high school and he gets caught smoking weed, well, he's probably not out with a bunch of people that are looking to score heroin, crack, meth, whatever. So putting him into a rehab before it's time is going to introduce them to an element that they might not otherwise ever encounter. And so you don't want to do that until it's actually the right time. And I want to go back to what you just said about, can you help that person who says, I don't want help? There's a big difference between that person and a teenager. A person, okay, first off, it's about responsibility. If that person is living their own life and responsible for themselves, well, then they're free to make the decision to not receive any help. Even if that means they're homeless. You want to continue being homeless. That's actually one of the more significant times that comes up is with homeless people. But a teenager under your roof, that's different. So just to be clear, a teenager that says, I don't want help, it's not like, oh, well, I guess he doesn't want help. No, you're under my roof. I'll beat you into submission. You're going to get some help.
Yeah.
I meant that metaphorically, not literally.
You don't want the child services to come.
Yeah, don't want child services.
Yeah.
But no, I really, in most cases with a parent that feels like their child is smoking weed too much, you want to get a professional involved that can help guide you. I don't know if that means a therapist. I don't know if that means somebody like me to talk to them, but it's important to recognize, listen, whether you want to admit it or not, you probably play somewhat of a role in this. Mm-hmm. And so get to the bottom of all that before you jump to sending the kid off to a rehab. Not to mention rehabs are incredibly expensive.
Oh, they are. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I did at least $15,000, $20,000 a month.
Oh, yeah.
And the thing is, they can give that money to you, and you can do a lot more.
I will come to your house if you want to spend $15,000. I'll stay at your house for a month.
Take that. Yeah, we can do a lot with that money. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wanted to, I guess, to give you a little background. So in our faith, any intoxicant that alters the mind is prohibited. Mm-hmm. All right, and that's the principle. So even though it was a prophetic saying over 1,400 years ago, that rules applies. So whatever falls under that category, it can be heroin, it can be weed, and so forth. Now there's a debate over cigarettes because cigarettes doesn't really alter the mind; it's an addiction, and it's harmful to the body. So there's a debate about it being prohibited or not, and many scholars have prohibited it in our faith. Some say it's disliked. For the most part, I personally never want my kids to smoke cigarettes.
Sure.
But then before the cigarette happens and before there's gateways to those things. And I want to ask you, you have vaping, mm-hmm. right? You have hookah. You know what hookah is, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have this new thing called CBD. Mm-hmm. All right. What are your thoughts on these things as gateways, not to only smoking cigarette, but to weed? And the thing we have in our faith is something called preventative measures. You prevent the thing from it happening. And whatever leads to something, you should stop it from, doing it, because eventually you may be disciplined, mm-hmm. but it can lead to a path where, So about those. And also, can you talk a little bit about CBD? Because it's something I heard about recently, and it's accessible mm-hmm. in the markets to everyone. And people are asking, should I sell this stuff or not? And some people mix it with or take out the THC from it. So I don't know what you think about those things.
Yeah, that's... I ever since I've known you, you've had a habit of doing that, like throwing this, that's a big topic. It's like, what do I think about those things? Well, what I really want to comment on is the gateway principle. If you listen to this or watch this or whatever and take nothing else from this, please hear me on this. Something is only a gateway if there's a problem that's worth going through that gate for. A person whose life is whole, a person whose life doesn't have the trauma, doesn't have issues, they're not going to look at things and use them as a gateway. Addiction is a way of trying to escape pain. If you're that afraid your child is going to use something as a gateway, then you probably should take the time to figure out what they're trying to escape from. Now, all different types of parenting styles, I don't make the rules on that. I just know that society around us sometimes is going to dictate whether or not a child is feeling like they're experiencing trauma at the house. And I'm not qualified to answer that if you're putting your child through trauma or not. But if you think that there's a reason a person wants to go through a gateway, then you probably should get some professional help to figure out what your child's trying to escape from. Now, with that being said, I just believe in health. Okay. And being healthy, I think vaping is horrible. I think it's one of the worst things that's come out in the last decade. I think there's nothing good about it. Okay. Personally, we have a problem in the ministry where it's men coming in for recovery. And so they all want to smoke. I hate smoking too, but I'd much rather we were in a world that didn't have smoking or vaping. Unfortunately, we don't. We live in this world. I don't think vaping is a good thing. And I absolutely do not think that children should be vaping at all. I would be more upset with my kid vaping than I would be smoking weed.
And why is that?
Because weed, I get it. You think there's a high there. You think it might be fun. Mm-hmm. I'd knock my kid upside the head and be like, it's not fun. Don't do that. It's going to ruin your life. Okay. Vaping. What in the world why are you vaping? What are you getting out of it? This is just me talking to my kid.
Yeah.
You know, that's how I would be to him. Why? You look stupid. You're dictating, you're giving your life over to something and you don't even know what's in that stuff half the time. Correct. Why? And we don't even know what the long-term effects are. Correct. So absolutely, I'm against all those things, not because of gateway, just because I think they're bad. Mm-hmm. When it comes hookah, it goes without saying. I don't know why people do that. I definitely wouldn't want my kids doing it. I know it's relaxing or something, but I don't think it's good.
Some people say it's worse than cigarettes, actually.
Yeah.
And I guess I'll take it time to everyone listening to this. Like we have like 30 hookah lounges in Tampa. I don't want any parent to not ever allow their kids to hookah. And as parents, we should stop going there themselves. Yeah. And set the prime example, I think, with when it comes to hookah lounges. And what about CBD? Okay,
CBD is interesting because I do think that there's a lot of medical properties in THC, THC less CBD, CBD without THC, whatever. There is a lot of, properties that can be helpful. But with that being said, not for kids, not for teenagers. And I think that most of the stuff now that is CBD, it's probably just a ripoff and it's just a way to make money. You put CBD. I saw CBD ice cream. Like, I don't, what is CBD ice cream about? Anyways, so I think the majority of stuff out there is trying to get your money. But I do think there are, medical properties to CBD when it's, from a doctor and administered right. And it's
medically that's different. Yeah. But as a parent, you would never want your kid to be near CBD.
Yeah, I listen, okay.
For health reasons, I'm saying.
Yeah, let's say it this way, okay? Mm-hmm. Maybe you know this, but let's just say to the general public watching, listening, they probably don't. Okay, the human brain is an amazing, amazing thing. But it is most pliable from, age up to the age of 25, right? Therefore, if my kid was like, Dad, I am absolutely trying psychedelics. I'm absolutely trying weed. I'm absolutely trying all these things. And I could only plead with him one thing. That one thing would be like, could you do it after you're 25? Because up till 25, that pliability is when the malleability of the brain can lead us down courses of direction we don't want to go down. And it also can cause damage to the brain that at that stage doesn't heal. Now, after 25, the brain's an amazing part of us, our human anatomy, and it's shown that it can heal and the cells can regenerate. The problem with anything before 25 is that when we do things, it's kind of like a GPS. And it's almost like when when after 25, we tend to have our GPS locked into a coordinate. And no matter what we do, it finds itself back to that coordinate. But before we're 25, when we do things, it moves the coordinate. It moves the destination. So after 25, the destination's locked. It'll find its way back to being normal. Before 25, you're doing things like weed and any of these drugs, then the destination shifts. It changes because the brain, just like addiction does not discriminate. It does not hold true to our faith. It tends to just act as an organ in the body. And it feels like, oh, you want to go to this destination. And therefore, like the damage that can happen by doing any of these things we're talking about, or worse, of course, before the age of 25, is going to have a much longer term consequence than after 25.
Yeah, and even after 25.
Yeah.
You still, we always have to think ourselves, people are looking at what we say, at what we do.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I can tell my kids all day and all night that not to do this, but if they see me doing it, right? So it's like, that's why it comes like that caring about one another and being selfless, because we live in a very individualistic society now, where everyone's concerned about themselves and their well-being, and not knowing that, hey, I'm a role model. People are looking up to me, and I'm an example in my own household. So I can't tell my kid not to do something, and I'm doing it myself. Mm-hmm. Even though I'm telling myself I'm disciplined. We can't expect that from them at that age. So that what you said makes a lot of sense. So that being said, I guess there's you have other things like oxycodone, Adderall, all these different things that people throw out there. And now with marijuana becoming legal and even medically prescribed, and there's a thing in our faith where pain is a part of life. Like when a woman gives birth, there's a high reward in that, because we don't even if we were to spend the rest of my life trying to make up to my mother, I would never make up for that pain she felt at the moment she gave birth, right? And a part of it is having feeling certain type of struggle. It's a healthy kind of pain. Like we fast all day during the month of Ramadan, the 7 days we don't eat and drink, and sometimes it can be tough. And some days we have exams during those days. We play sports, but that's a part of growth. Yeah, right. A lot of people are not used to kind of everything. And a lot of parents buffer their kids and don't give them that experience. That being said, I personally when if say I was to go to the doctor, you never want to be addicted to pain medication. Would you recommend marijuana if used in those cases as something that you would say to your family, hey, you know what, take this marijuana, it's medically accepted, and just go with it? Would you be okay with that? Would you recommend that?
Well, for one, let me just be clear. I'm not a medical doctor, and so I won't be prescribing anybody anything today. So I will say this. I recently had a guy that I've known for the past 12 years. I hadn't seen him in a long time, but we came through, he came through recovery in my home church. So I know his life, his addiction story, and how severe it was. He told me he basically got hit by a car and shattered his leg in 4 different places. Bones were sticking through the skin, everything. And when the ambulance picked him up, he had it in him, the wherewithal to say, I'm an addict, do not give me narcotics. And the ambulance driver is like, are you kidding? Your bone is sticking out of your leg. He's like, do not give me narcotics. I applaud him for that, because I would have been like, give me the narcotics. But he went through that. He went through 2 surgeries without narcotics. However, the reason he was seeing me is he wanted my opinion on this. He had taken the doctor gave him an okay to smoke weed for pain. So the question became, did I feel like it was acceptable for him to smoke weed in this scenario? But he wasn't on, narcotic painkillers, which would have pushed him right back to his addiction. In that case, I looked at it from the sense of, is your life under control? Is the weed under control? Do you have accountability in this? Because of all those things, then it was, to me, which once again, I'm not a doctor, I felt like that was a better course of action than taking narcotics, which 95% of the doctors out there would have diagnosed. Mm-hmm. So I do feel like, there's a time where severe enough situations happen where if a medical doctor feels like marijuana may be an answer, and it may prevent you from doing something that could be long-term worse, then I think that's okay. it really comes down to a case-by-case situation where...
I think that's what it is, right? It's a case-by-case scenario.
Absolutely.
I don't think we can give probably a general answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I guess you know that person really well on a personal level, because you don't want it to be, if it's general, then everyone's just going to start doing it, and it can be out of control and sporadic. So I guess it'll go down to like a case-by-case thing. That being said, I mean, this was a heavy podcast. I mean, we talk about a lot of things, touch upon a lot of different subjects, and I look forward to doing others with you. What are some final remarks you would like to make or advise others about drug addiction to parents who are watching this and saying, what can I do to change my son's life or daughter's life? And what are some also, and we didn't talk about this, symptoms to look out for in a child to see if they're actually doing these things or not?
You're doing that thing again where you're like, oh, and then it's just like, okay, here's when it comes to symptoms, let's just start there. I think, you're looking for a kid who becomes disengaged, no longer cares about the things that he once cared about. Communication, where it was once there is no longer there. Changes in diet, changes in activities, changes in friend groups. That's generally the signs that a person's looking for. Obviously, that becomes confusing as a kid goes through, grade school, middle school, high school, because you're changing people groups. You're changing just general, a person changes in those times. So don't necessarily think that your kid who became moody in 8th grade is on heroin, because he may just be a moody 8th grader. But it is important to watch for those things. My advice is this. I've never seen a person begin using drugs that was living a fulfilled, accepted, loved life. So if you really feel like your kid is turning to drugs, then you got to look. I believe the first part of the journey should be internal. And what is your part in this? And maybe you didn't play one. Maybe you're doing everything right. But I would begin there. Mm-hmm. I would begin looking at, just how much time have you been spending with your child? How much, love and discipleship have you been giving to your child? And I would begin there, because you may find an answer there. If your child doesn't feel like they can come to you about anything, then you want to ask the question of why. That would be my advice there. And I think on closing, thoughts, whatever you think you know about addiction, whatever you think you know about recovery, if you've known it longer than the last couple of years, then you probably need to revisit what you know. I believe that this country has been brainwashed for a very, very long time. There is no war on drugs. That was a way for the government to systemically keep people in areas that they wanted to keep them. It was based on race, it was based on prejudice, and it's based on making sure that certain people groups got more than they deserved. Recognize that, in the 80s when they came out with Just Say No and that drugs are bad, those statements alone caused more harm and damage to people than you can even possibly imagine. Because if I'm an addict and I hear somebody say drugs are bad, then I feel even worse about myself for being an addict. We have to recognize that, addiction is a much more complicated issue than most people want to say it is. And part of the journey begins with understanding that a person's life experiences played a role in where they are at. If you're a parent, and even if your kid isn't one of the kids smoking weed, look at the things that they're going through. I highly recommend looking up an ACEs test, which, adverse childhood experiences. It basically, lists the things that if your kid went through this, they need to have therapy of some sort, or there's a high probability that down the road they will become somebody engrossed in addiction. Whether it's divorce, whether it's death, whether it's separation, whether it's physical or sexual abuse, All of these things lead to future decisions. So if you're raising your kids today and yours are the ones that are straight and perfect, and it's somebody else's kids that are smoking weed, count yourself as blessed, but also take a look at the life that you're leading and making sure that you're not contributing to their future being one that is riddled with pain. Because listen, we're all responsible for each other. I believe, the Bible says, am I my brother's keeper? And the answer is yes, I am my brother's keeper. And we are all each other's brother's keeper. And we need to play a role, understanding that role is one of being able to show the love and acceptance of whatever God we believe in that he wants us to show. It looks different for some, but we need to recognize that we play a role in the decisions of everyone. So learn new things about addiction. Learn that, you can make a difference just by understanding the way a person has lived their life up until the point that you knew them. And you can make a difference.
I really appreciate that. I really appreciate you sharing your story and giving us those insights. It really takes a lot to talk about that. And no matter how many times you say it still has the impact, and I really respect and admire for that. And I learned a lot from you today. And for anyone listening, anyone who has these issues, you can, hopefully you can start working with, TMC and Sober Truth Project, do a lot of these things together. And we're here for everyone. Like our goal today is to really say that you have a safe space. There is a platform. There is somewhere to go. There is someone to speak to. And, you want to make sure that's loud and clear that, hey, we make mistakes and we need to work together to remove this stigma and unite close. And we ask God to guide us to what's best and the truth. And I appreciate having you with us today, Pastor Rod. And I think we have many more interviews to come. I know. It's a Corona handshake.
I'm fine, man. I'm good. I think I think it's one of my the best things over the last couple of years has been my relationship with you and TMC, and just being here and being able to be part of what you guys are doing, because addiction doesn't discriminate, right? It just doesn't. It doesn't matter what faith you are, if you're rich, you're poor. It just doesn't.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And look forward to another one. Thank you guys for listening, and see you guys next time. Wassalamu alaikum.